It's the 1920s, and almost every major economy around the world is absolutely booming with unprecedented prosperity. The Roaring Twenties was a decade defined by opulent wealth, endless economic opportunity, and genuine optimism for humanity's future. With the devastating end of World War I in 1917, the global economy had become supercharged with post-war reconstruction and industrial expansion. Leading this worldwide economic boom was American industrial growth, which at its peak boasted almost half of the world's total manufacturing output. From 1920 to 1929, the U.S. economy expanded by a massive 42%, spurred on by the widespread adoption of revolutionary mass production techniques and the transformative introduction of electricity into factories and homes across the nation. The United Kingdom and France successfully rebuilt and maintained their powerful colonial empires that spanned continents, extracting wealth from territories across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Even Germany, despite being devastated by war and crippled by massive reparation payments, was starting to experience a major economic rebound by 1923, as industrial production returned to pre-war levels. However, this global economic euphoria came to an absolutely screeching halt with shocking suddenness. The stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression steamrolled the global economy like a devastating tsunami of financial destruction. U.S. industrial production plummeted by a catastrophic 47%, almost overnight. Unemployment soared to over 20% of the workforce, completely decimating the remarkable economic growth of the prior decade. Every single major economy around the world experienced incredible contractions to their industrial outputs, national incomes, and employment levels. Well, except for one notable exception. Largely cut off from global economic banking systems and international trade networks, as well as being naturally insulated from external demand shocks, the Soviet Union was the single country that didn't just survive the Great Depression, but actually thrived during this period of worldwide economic collapse. Rather than contracting like every other major economy, the Soviet economy continued its dramatic economic and industrial boom, incredibly increasing its total industrial output between 1929 and 1934 by a whopping 50%, all while maintaining effectively zero unemployment across the entire nation. In light of such a major economic downturn happening simultaneously across the capitalist world, some Western economists began praising the Soviet communist economic system, with certain prominent scholars going as far as to claim its clear superiority over traditional Western capitalism and free market economics. This apparent economic miracle seems to validate everything the Bolsheviks had promised about their revolutionary system. In just a span of 40 years, the Soviet Union had transformed itself from being a backwards, impoverished agricultural monarchy ruled by an incompetent czar into becoming the defeater of fascism, the first nation to successfully launch both an artificial satellite and human being into outer space, and the largest sole proprietor of weapons of mass destruction ever assembled. The Soviet Union had catapulted itself onto the world stage as one of only two remaining global superpowers, wielding the largest military force and maintaining the second largest economy on Earth. However, as quickly and dramatically as it had risen to prominence, the Soviet Union would eventually collapse completely as a direct result of its fundamentally flawed and ultimately crumbling economy. But why did this happen? How was the once envied Soviet economic system, which had seemed so successful during the Great Depression, now lying in complete ruins, having left only a bloodied and tragic print on human history? Here at Economic Rewind, we've studied the rise and fall of economic systems, and the Soviet story reveals crucial lessons about the dangers of centralized economic planning and political tyranny. To truly understand the Soviet economy and the inevitable path it ultimately took toward collapse, we need to comprehend the fundamental historical forces and social conditions that caused this particular system to arise in Russia in the first place. To accomplish this understanding, we must travel all the way back to medieval Europe and examine the divergent paths taken by Eastern and Western European societies. Following the catastrophic fall of the mighty Roman Empire, the dominant form of government across European territories became feudalism, a hierarchical system that would shape the continent's development for centuries. Feudalism was a rigid social and economic system in which a king would personally own all the land throughout his entire country as his private property. To maintain effective control and provide security across vast territories, the king would strategically divide up this land and distribute large portions to a privileged class of lords and nobles. In exchange for receiving these valuable land grants, the lords would be obligated to provide trained military forces for the king, whenever needed for warfare or maintaining internal order. The lords would then extract economic value from their holdings by forcing the vast peasant population to pay heavily for the privilege of living and working on the land. This exploitation took the form of crushing taxes and extensive unpaid labor requirements. This oppressive arrangement was called serfdom, and the peasants, known as serfs, were literally tied to the land, meaning they were legally prohibited from moving away or seeking better opportunities without obtaining explicit consent from their lord. This entire system was deliberately designed to exploit the vast lower classes and ensure that the small amounts of wealth produced by agricultural labor would flow upward to benefit the wealthy elites. Economic historians classify this type of arrangement as an extractive economic system, and it can only be maintained through an equally extractive political system that prevents change. The political structure supporting feudalism was elegantly simple and brutally effective. The only people with any real power to change conditions in the country were the small group of lords and the king himself. Therefore, it was nearly impossible for the peasants' desperate situation to improve, since the ruling elites had a powerful vested interest in keeping things exactly as they were. And for many centuries, this oppressive system remained remarkably stable. However, in the year 1346, in the port city of Tana, where the Don River meets the Black Sea in what is now modern-day Russia, the first known European case of the bubonic plague, also called the Black Death, appeared among the population. Having been spread from China via the extensive Silk Road trading networks, this devastating plague quickly swept across the entire European continent, killing approximately 50% of the population in every region it reached. The extreme loss of life among the peasant population fundamentally shook the foundations of the feudal system to its very core. With this sudden and massive scarcity of available labor, the economic value of peasant work had dramatically skyrocketed, and consequently, their power to bargain for better conditions increased exponentially. Faced with severe shortages of workers needed to maintain agricultural production, desperate lords across Western Europe started attempting to steal one another's peasants by promising to eliminate extensive unpaid labor requirements and significantly reduce tax burdens. This competitive bidding for scarce labor eventually resulted in the near total or complete abolishment of unpaid labor obligations, significantly improving peasants' living conditions, accumulated wealth, and political power to demand further beneficial changes. By 1351, the English government, in a desperate attempt to maintain the traditional power and wealth of the established elites, instituted a statute that would punish peasants with prison time if they dared to move away from their current lord's land. This legal restriction was designed to artificially fix wages and unpaid labor requirements at pre-plague levels, essentially freezing the social system in place. However, the peasants were not willing to see their newfound freedoms disappear without a fight. This resistance culminated in the massive peasant rebellion of 1381 in England, which saw armed rebels successfully taking control of London itself. Eventually, the rebellion was violently suppressed by the king's forces. However, there was never another serious attempt to enforce the restrictive statute. Similar uprisings happened throughout Western Europe, effectively creating new, more inclusive labor markets that gave workers significantly more bargaining power. Unlike an extractive economic system that relies solely on the desires and interests of the upper classes, an inclusive system operates on market equilibrium principles where wages cannot be artificially suppressed, but rather workers are compensated based on their actual economic value to employers. While Western European peasants after the plague were by no means living in a truly inclusive system, their situation was, importantly, much less extractive than it had been before the Black Death. This small but crucial gain in economic wealth translated directly into increased political power to organize and demand changes in the future. Over time, these incremental improvements compounded until broader coalitions of workers, soldiers, merchants, and other groups could successfully rise up to make demands or even completely remake the political and economic system to be more inclusive and fair. When a coalition becomes sufficiently broad and representative, it prevents any single group from making a power grab to establish themselves as the new ruling elite. Unlike their Western European counterparts, Eastern European peasants faced completely different conditions. They were more spread out across vast territories, lived in smaller villages, and were less organized politically, while their lords controlled larger and more powerful holdings. In response to labor scarcity from the plague, Eastern lords took a different approach. Instead of competing for peasant labor by offering better conditions, they seized more lands while clamping down on peasants even more harshly. Since Eastern peasants were less politically powerful and geographically dispersed, their rebellions either never materialized or failed miserably. Rather than gaining freedoms, Eastern European serfs had more rights taken away during this crucial period. This trend worsened during the 16th century, when Western demand for Eastern agricultural products grew rapidly. With increased export demand, Eastern lords calculated it was profitable to place tighter controls on peasants, demand more unpaid labor, and impose heavier taxes. The gap in wealth, power, and freedoms between Western and Eastern European peasants widened over centuries, creating fundamentally different trajectories. While Western Europe developed inclusive institutions, property rights, and democratic governance, Eastern Europe remained trapped in extractive systems, concentrating power in elite hands. This divergence explains why the Industrial Revolution bypassed Eastern European societies. The innovations, capital accumulation, and institutional changes driving industrial development required inclusive systems that emerged in the West, but were absent in the East. By the 19th century, this gap had become enormous. Western nations had developed strong property rights, constitutional governments, competitive markets, and educated populations that adapted to technological change. Eastern European societies, particularly Russia, remained dominated by autocratic politics and extractive economics that discouraged innovation. The Russian Empire exemplified this pattern. Despite enormous natural resources, vast territories, and large populations, Russia remained economically backward and politically oppressive. The Tsarist system concentrated all power in an absolute monarch, while the economy remained dominated by primitive agriculture and exploited serf labor. When revolutionary pressures finally overthrew the Tsarist system in 1917, the crucial question was whether Russia would transition toward inclusive institutions that enabled Western prosperity, or whether new extractive systems would simply replace the old ones. Unfortunately, the Bolshevik Revolution led by Lenin represented not a transition toward inclusive institutions, but establishment of an entirely new extractive system, one that proved even more controlling and economically devastating than Tsarism. The Bolsheviks were not a broad coalition representing different groups with power checks and balances. Instead, they were a narrow, ideologically driven party that seized total control. This power concentration created perfect conditions for establishing new extractive systems with different people at the top. Here at Economic Rewind, we've observed that concentrating economic power, regardless of ideology, tends to create extractive systems benefiting elites at ordinary people's expense. The Soviet economic system that emerged under Lenin and was later expanded by Stalin represented one of the most ambitious attempts in human history to replace market mechanisms with centralized government planning. The fundamental premise was that intelligent bureaucrats, armed with scientific planning methods, could coordinate economic activity more efficiently than the supposedly chaotic and wasteful market system that characterized capitalist countries. This centralized approach initially appeared to work remarkably well because the Soviet Union was starting from such an extremely low baseline of economic development. Moving millions of people from subsistence agriculture into basic industrial production could generate impressive growth statistics, even if the underlying system was fundamentally inefficient and wasteful of resources. The Soviet planning system operated through elaborate 5-year plans that attempted to coordinate the production and distribution of literally millions of different goods and services across the vast Soviet territory. Central planners in Moscow would decide what should be produced, where it should be manufactured, how much should be made, and where the finished products should be distributed to consumers. These detailed plans were transmitted down through a massive bureaucratic hierarchy to regional administrators, then to specific industries, and finally to individual enterprise managers who were responsible for implementing the production targets at the factory level. However, this system suffered from several fatal flaws that made efficient economic coordination impossible, regardless of the intelligence or dedication of the people involved in the planning process. The first major problem was the complete absence of meaningful price signals that could guide resource allocation decisions effectively. In market economies, prices automatically adjust to reflect supply and demand conditions, signaling where resources are most needed and where they are being wasted. The Soviet system abolished market pricing and tried to replace it with bureaucratic decisions. But bureaucrats could never possess the information necessary to make efficient allocation decisions across millions of products and services. The second critical flaw involved the perverse incentive structures created by the planning system. Enterprise managers were evaluated and rewarded based solely on meeting centrally determined production targets, regardless of the costs involved or the quality of goods produced. This created powerful incentives for waste, inefficiency, and gaming the system, rather than genuine productivity improvements. When enterprise managers negotiated with central planners about production targets, they had every incentive to overstate their input needs and understate their productive capacity. Since managers were only concerned with meeting planned output levels, they didn't care about cost effectiveness and consistently requested as many inputs as possible, raw materials, machinery, and workers, to ensure they could hit their targets without difficulty. Central planners tried to improve efficiency by demanding higher output each year with the same level of inputs. And they incentivized managers through bonuses for exceeding targets. However, the managers were smart enough to realize that producing significantly above their targets would simply result in higher targets the following year, making their jobs more difficult and stressful. Consequently, actual output was almost always either slightly above the target or significantly below it. If targets seemed achievable, managers would stop production once they reached the goal. If targets appeared impossible to reach, there was no incentive to work harder, so production would remain as low as possible, while managers hoped for reduced targets the following year. Supply chains throughout the Soviet system were notoriously unreliable and sporadic, which meant that factories often had too many workers with nothing to do, followed by periods when excess labor was desperately needed to meet quotas when materials finally arrived. Enterprise managers therefore requested as many employees as possible and were extremely reluctant to reduce their workforce, even when workers weren't productive. This resulted in Soviet factories typically employing twice as many workers as comparable facilities in market economies. While the Soviet Union achieved virtually zero unemployment, better than any capitalist society then or now, this was due to legal guarantees and systemic inefficiencies rather than superior economic productivity that created genuine value. The problem became even worse when factories received new equipment that could potentially improve productivity. This machinery often remained unused because enterprise managers lacked incentives to increase efficiency and were concerned that implementing new technology would disrupt production enough to cause them to miss their annual targets. Most of these incentive problems stemmed from the fundamental issue of limited information. Successfully planning an entire industrialized economy requires complete and accurate information about supply and demand conditions across millions of products. But Soviet planners never had access to this crucial data. In market economies, this information problem is solved automatically through price signals that reflect the collective knowledge and preferences of millions of consumers and producers. But in the Soviet system, prices were set arbitrarily by bureaucrats who had no reliable way to determine optimal production levels or resource allocation. Here's something I bet many of you can relate to. Have you ever dealt with slow, frustrating government bureaucracy? Maybe at the DMV, post office, or tax department. Now, imagine if those same people were in charge of producing all the food, cars, and electronics in your country. Scary thought, right? Tell me about your worst bureaucracy experience in the comments. The last, and arguably most devastating failure of the Soviet economic system was its complete inability to generate meaningful innovation or technological advancement. In capitalist societies, ever since secure property rights were established and maintained by effective legal institutions, there have been powerful financial incentives for individuals and companies to create new inventions and develop more productive manufacturing processes, because inventors could patent their ideas and profit substantially from their innovations. Innovation in market economies is driven by the prospect of extraordinary financial rewards for those who solve important problems or create valuable new products. Entrepreneurs and inventors know that if they develop something truly useful, they can become wealthy by selling their innovations to consumers who voluntarily choose to purchase them. In the Soviet Union, however, with wages fixed and determined by government bureaucrats according to rigid salary scales, extremely limited ranges of consumer goods available for purchase, even if you had money, and the persistent fear that innovation might somehow be viewed as politically dangerous or ideologically suspect, there was essentially no meaningful incentive for ordinary Soviet citizens to engage in creative problem-solving or technological development. The Soviet system actively discouraged individual initiative and innovation because such activities could be seen as criticism of official state policies or as attempts to profit from individual effort rather than contributing to collective goals. The political climate made people afraid to stand out or propose changes that might be interpreted as questioning the wisdom of central planners. Innovation is widely recognized as the primary driver of long-term economic growth in developed economies. And without organic technological advancement emerging from the creative efforts of its own people, the Soviet Union was forced to attempt importing innovation by purchasing advanced machinery and technology from Western companies and trying to reverse engineer foreign innovations. This expensive approach included costly arrangements, such as contracting with the Italian automotive company Fiat to build an entire modern automobile factory for the Soviet Union, since domestic Soviet manufacturers completely lacked the technological capability and expertise to produce consumer vehicles that could compete with Western models in terms of quality, reliability, or efficiency. The Soviets also purchased entire chemical plants, computer systems, and manufacturing equipment from Western companies, hoping to copy and adapt these technologies for their own use. However, simply buying foreign technology was extremely expensive, and Soviet leaders strongly disliked relying on Western nations for anything, especially crucial technological innovations that could affect national security or economic competitiveness. These massive importation costs were significantly compounded by the chronic inefficiency of Soviet agriculture, which consistently failed to produce enough food to feed the population adequately, necessitating enormous food imports from capitalist countries to prevent widespread famine and social unrest. The combination of technology imports and food imports created enormous financial pressures that strained even the Soviet Union's substantial natural resource wealth and export revenues from oil and gas sales. Fortunately for the Soviet economy, during certain periods, the country was blessed with immense oil and natural gas reserves, particularly in the vast Siberian territories. When global oil prices skyrocketed during the 1970s due to Middle Eastern conflicts and OPEC policies, the Soviet Union could temporarily offset much of its importation costs by exporting petroleum products to international markets at historically high prices. However, as easily accessible oil reserves in Western Russia and other traditional production areas began to dry up, and global oil prices returned to normal levels during the 1980s, importation costs mounted once again, and economic growth stagnated dramatically across all sectors of the Soviet economy. It was also during this critical historical period that the Soviet Union could no longer continue dramatically increasing economic inputs, since most of the population had already been successfully moved from low-productivity agricultural work into higher productivity industrial jobs. This structural transition had been the primary source of Soviet economic growth for several decades, but it was a one-time transformation that could only happen once. By the 1980s, Soviet economic growth had slowed to just 2% annually, which was actually lower than the growth rates achieved by developed Western economies during the same period. The only significant economic gains were coming from allocating massive amounts of scarce capital toward military spending and weapons production. But this military focus actually reduced living standards for ordinary citizens while contributing nothing to long-term economic development or technological progress. The gap between Soviet economic performance and that of NATO countries began growing rapidly once again, fundamentally undermining the political legitimacy of the communist system. The steady economic growth that had kept Soviet citizens reasonably content, despite their lack of political freedoms and limited consumer choices, began to disappear. And the massively inefficient and unresponsive political system put the country on an irreversible trajectory toward economic stagnation and eventual complete collapse. Here at Economic Rewind, we believe the seeds of Soviet economic collapse had actually been planted long before the nation even came into existence. Unlike the gradual revolutions in Western Europe and the United States that had slowly expanded rights and freedoms through broad-based social movements representing multiple interest groups, the Bolsheviks who seized control in Russia were not a representative coalition, but rather a narrow ideological party with limited popular support. Left with completely unchecked political and economic power after eliminating all opposition parties and independent institutions, they did not create new, inclusive institutions that could adapt and improve over time in response to changing circumstances. Instead, they constructed new extractive systems with themselves positioned at the top of the hierarchy, operating very much like the Tsarist elites they had violently overthrown. By the 1960s, when the Soviet Union's ability to generate growth simply by increasing inputs had been completely exhausted, the economic system desperately needed to transition toward innovation-driven development that would require more flexibility, decentralization, individual initiative, and market-based incentives. However, this absolutely necessary economic transformation never occurred because the Communist Party leadership steadfastly refused to allow any significant reforms that might threaten their complete monopoly on political and economic power. Just as the elites of the Russian Empire had consistently resisted the creative destruction of industrialization that might have reduced their traditional privileges and social status, the elites of the Communist Party actively resisted implementing any meaningful political or economic changes that would have enabled genuine productivity improvements and technological advancement. This systematic resistance occurred because party leaders clearly understood that meaningful economic reforms would necessarily reduce their personal power and accumulated wealth, and might potentially trigger popular uprisings or political movements that could cost them their privileged positions or even their lives. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev finally attempted to institute real democratic and economic reforms during the 1980s, it was already far too late to save the fundamentally flawed system. The economy was already experiencing serious instability due to decades of accumulated inefficiencies, and by loosening the Communist Party's iron grip on political power, Gorbachev inadvertently caused the entire system to collapse completely. The Soviet Union ceased to exist, not because of military defeat or natural disasters, but because its extractive economic and political institutions have become completely unsustainable in a world where inclusive institutions provided enormous advantages in technological development and economic productivity. Here at Economic Rewind, we see striking parallels between the Soviet experience and several modern economies that have struggled with similar centralized planning approaches. Venezuela provides perhaps the most dramatic contemporary example of how resource wealth, combined with socialist economic policies, can lead to catastrophic collapse. Despite possessing the world's largest proven oil reserves, Venezuela's economy has contracted by over 75% since 2014 due to price controls, currency manipulation, and the systematic destruction of private enterprise. The Venezuelan government followed the classic Soviet playbook, nationalizing industries, implementing price controls, and printing money to finance government spending. The results have been predictably disastrous, with hyperinflation exceeding 1 million%, mass emigration, and widespread poverty despite enormous natural wealth. China presents a more complex case study that demonstrates both the potential and limitations of centralized economic management. The Chinese Communist Party learned crucial lessons from the Soviet collapse and implemented market-oriented reforms while maintaining strict political control. However, China's remarkable success has come primarily from allowing private enterprise and market mechanisms to operate within certain sectors, rather than from pure central planning. As China's economy matures and faces the need for innovation-driven growth, it increasingly confronts the same fundamental challenges that ultimately destroyed the Soviet system. The tension between political control and economic flexibility remains unresolved. Other countries, like Cuba and North Korea, continue to demonstrate the long-term unsustainability of centrally planned economies, with both nations remaining economically stagnant and dependent on external support despite decades of revolutionary rhetoric. Even Nordic countries, often cited as examples of successful socialism, actually combine market economies with extensive social welfare programs, rather than implementing true central planning. The fundamental lesson remains unchanged. Economies that concentrate decision-making power in the hands of government bureaucrats, regardless of their good intentions, cannot generate the information, incentives, and innovation necessary for sustained prosperity. The Soviet pattern continues to repeat itself wherever similar systems are attempted, proving that the problems were systematic rather than simply the result of poor implementation. This brings up a fascinating question for today's world. What do you think about countries like China that combine authoritarian politics with market economics? Have they figured out how to avoid the Soviet trap? Or are they just delaying the inevitable? And what about in your own country? Are there areas where you see too much government control creeping in? I read every comment, so share your thoughts below. If you found this deep dive into Soviet economics eye-opening, you'll love our other analyses of historical economic disasters. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming episodes on hyperinflation catastrophes, the rise and fall of economic bubbles, and why some countries get rich while others stay poor. And if this video helped you understand economics better, give it a thumbs up. It really helps us reach more people who want to learn about these crucial historical lessons. What economic topic should we tackle next? Let me know in the comments, and I might just feature your suggestion in our next video.